Hello and thanks for tuning in. I am Victoria and I currently work at the Max Planck Institute in Frankfurt, and I am a PhD candidate at the Goethe University here as well. Can literary refugee narratives decrease in-group bias? This might seem like a very specific question, and it indeed is. So how come that I'm interested in this very particular possible effect of narratives? This research question is one of the too many that I'm trying to answer in my project Increasing Interest, Planned Participation and Reduced Stereotypes, an empirical study into the effects of reading engaged literature. Here I am interested in possible effects of reading literature, namely those that have not yet been studied widely and which potentially carry over into what is often referred to as the real world in contrast to the text world, and affect readers long term. So while these effects are most likely mediated by readers' thoughts about the narrative and their engagement with fictional characters, ultimately I am not so much concerned with the relationship between readers and story characters, but effects that manifest within the relationship between readers and people which are or which they perceive as being like the characters. For example, I'm interested whether readers, after reading stories with a fictional refugee vocalizer, communicate differently about refugees in general. To investigate whether the observed effects were short-term or long-term, the setup included measurements before, directly after, and 2 weeks after reading. As an originally literary scholar, it was very important to me to match the studied effects with the genre that I drew my reading material for the study from. The engaged migration literature I used, showing the perspective of refugees when trying to settle in a new country, arguably uses literary techniques like first-person vocalization, emotive language, takes as rich descriptions, realistic details, frequent highlighting of false stereotypic assumption about characters that can surely be hypothesized to affect the image or representation that readers have of refugees, as well as their awareness of the problems they face. In this study, participants either read 2 of Sam Rapidwin's short stories on refugees in the original first-person perspective, in a manipulated third-person perspective, or they were part of the control group and read stories of similar length which did not deal with the subject of refugees. And last but not least, I found that for effects that are not frequently tested, new types of fine-grained measurements had to be developed, which had the benefit that I could make sure that these measurements were implicit. So, for example, they were not directly asking for participants' view on refugees. As this is the particular delicate subject with strong social desirability beliefs attached, and the answers that one would get would not accurately reflect participants' view, I think. So instead, I prompted their portrayal of refugee actors by an image-based creative writing task and employed linguistic analysis to assess whether portrayals between participants of the test and the control group differed in interesting ways. In fact, in last year's IGEL conference, I presented some findings of an outgroup portrayal task which showed that, compared to a control group which did not read the refugee stories, test group participants, even after 2 weeks and even after reading only these 2 stories, would portray outgroup characters strikingly different. So in this creative writing task, they would better remember refugee characters' names and they would individualize them further compared to control participants. Also, they tend to choose different types of endings for characters, more happy ends for outgroup characters if they have read the story in first person, which I would interpret as a sign that they care more for outgroup characters' well-being and entertain wishful thinking related to these outgroup characters. The linguistic analysis also showed that in contrast to control participants, readers of refugee narratives were less likely to excuse in-group actors for unsocial behavior and would explain unsocial behavior of refugees more often, thus showing considerably less in-group favoritism. In this creative writing task, there were also differences in emotion portrayal of refugees between groups, differences in the amount of direct speech the refugee characters got, and on multiple other dimensions. This then gave me reason to speculate that we would find similar differences between readers that have and have not read refugee narratives on other measures. For example, on a measurement of stereotypical expectancies regarding in- and out-group actors when it comes to intergroup or in-group bias, as assessed by the linguistic intergroup bias test, or short LIB. So what is the LIB? The LIB is based on linguistic research by Fischer and Semin and was empirically tested by them and the psychologist Anna Maas in multiple studies. The model is based on the idea that people tend to use abstract language to describe actions which they believe to be stereotypical of a certain group, and concrete language to describe unusual or uncharacteristic behavior. This way of speaking reflects the beliefs of the speaker regarding the agent's intrinsic character, Generally, humans have an in-group bias, meaning that actors of the in-group are perceived more positively. So for an in-group actor, a positive action would be described in abstract terms because he would regard it as based on an inherent characteristic. For example, the person is helpful, rather than the person lends the hammer to the other person. A non-social negative action by an in-group actor would be viewed as atypical and therefore described in a way that suggests that this action is only situational and non-recurring. For example, rather the person smokes in the car, then the person is inconsiderate. The reverse is then true for actors of the out-group. A positive action would be described in concrete terms and a negative action in abstract terms, using, for example, negative adjectives to describe the person. Using these different levels of linguistic abstraction serves to maintain a positive in-group bias and a negative out-group bias, and also communicates this information to others, meaning that we as listeners unconsciously understand the bias that is communicated, but not as bias, but as information about the actor. If this actor is described as being helpful, listeners assume that the character not only helped in this situation, but is likely to do so in others because it is part of his noble disposition. Of course, we can also scrutinize and question the evaluations behind the telling of another, but this is an additional process, not one that takes place routinely when processing speech. The LIT test uses images which show socially desirable or undesirable actions and afterwards presents 4 sentences that all describe the action or the actor with varying degrees of abstraction. Participants are then asked to rate each of the 4 sentences on a scale from 1 to 10 for its fit to describe the picture. Based on these responses, a LIP score is calculated. A higher score indicates that a participant shows a higher in-group bias. A score below 0 would mean that the person shows an out-group instead of an in-group bias. The setup in my experiment was slightly different to those of earlier studies. First of all, a bigger set of different pictures was used, while the score was calculated after seeing only 5 or 6 items in some previous studies. In total, participants in my experiment saw 45 images, 15 before reading, comprising a baseline measure, another 15 directly after reading, and the last 15 2 weeks later when participants returned to our lab to see whether there are any long-term effects. To my knowledge, the use of the lip as a repeated measurement has never before been attempted, and previous research investigated the effects that the lip had on other measures or the other way around. What were our hypotheses? First of all, I hypothesized that on the baseline measure before reading, all groups would show no significant difference. For the control group, I expect also no significant differences between all measurement time points. And then, if differences would occur, a decrease in in-group bias would be expected for the test groups, comparing baseline and after-reading measurements. Related to the theory and the results of the out-group portrayal task that took place after 2 weeks and showed especially strong results when test participants had read the stories from first-person perspective, I would expect a stronger decrease for participants that read refugee short stories from a first-person point of view. So let's see if that is what we find in the data. First, if we look at the baseline measure, there are, as hypothesized, no significant differences across treatment groups, and the data looks relatively normally distributed. Participants are possibly a little less biased than we would have imagined, but it is hard to compare these findings to other studies as they use different material, different images. For example, the situations shown on the pictures might be more extreme and thus elicit stronger feelings in participants. Also, I report a lip score that combines the rating scores of all 4 sentences, whereas in some studies they use the results of the most abstract sentence only, because participants show the most in-group bias on this sentence type, which frankly sounds to me a bit like p-hacking if you do not give very good theoretical reasons why this should be the only lip predictor. It also does not reflect what I saw in my data. Looking at the lip scores for each sentence type separately did not confirm the other studies' finding that intergroup bias showed more prominently on the most abstract category. Instead, ratings of participants on the different sentence types correlated, indicating that the test set of images and sentences that I used in my study is working well as an instrument to assess linguistic intergroup bias overall. If we now turn to hypothesis number 2, we see that the control group does not change significantly over time, as we would have imagined. So let's come to the more exciting part. Are there changes in test groups, and are these changes like we imagined them? And the answer to this is no. We see no significant differences for treatment and or measuring time point in none of the groups. Text liking did also not predict changes. This was one of the mediators that I would have thought possible to influence the results. Maybe only you really like the story, you engage with it sufficiently to make it change your stereotypical beliefs. But the answer to this is also no. Neither the liking of the text nor any other of the 13 engagement measures, like identification, pity, emotional or cognitive engagement, did influence the lip significantly. One conclusion could be that the lip is not a good instrument for repeated measurements. This might explain why, to my knowledge, nobody has ever tried using it as a tool to investigate changes in intergroup bias. But on the other hand, why should it not be a good tool? Theoretically, I think nothing speaks against it, using it as a repeated measurement tool. The other conclusion could be that reading two short narratives about and from the perspective of refugees does not change a person's intergroup bias. Why I am not entirely happy with this conclusion either. Not so much because I think it cannot be true. Honestly, I think this sounds quite reasonable, but it does not correspond to what I found in the other implicit measurement, the creative writing task that I talked about in the beginning. And maybe now you understand why I took recourse to these findings in the beginning of my talk. Here we saw that refugees were portrayed very differently from the test groups than they were portrayed in the control groups. And we saw convergent here on very different kinds of textual features, from remembered or given names to focalization to how much room for direct speech characters were given. So one might say that the lip results might be robust, but the creative writing task results might not be. To this I would answer that as these textual features are so manifold and our participants were not even professional writers, I am quite certain that they did not, simply because they were not able to fake the positive outgroup image on the creative writing task. And if they were able to fake it on the creative writing task, why did they not also do so on the lip? So if findings from both tasks, the lip and the creative writing task, are legitimate, it seems that intergroup bias, as elicited by choosing descriptions for images, or positive or negative outgroup portrayal as elicited by writing and thinking deeply about one situation and the actors involved in it, are two completely different effects. And the way I framed it just now maybe already gives a hint to why this could be the case. Maybe a change in outgroup portrayal can come through if we have time to reflect and consider the circumstances of another person's actions. Whereas immediate perception, where a response needs to be made in a couple of seconds, might continue to be biased by thinking in terms of in and out groups. But maybe you have some other thoughts and comments on this, and I'd be really happy to hear them in the IGEL conference. Thank you so much for listening, and see you at IGEL 2022.